Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and everything in between. Welcome back to GEEXX Reads. Today I want to talk about The Sleeping Dragon by Joel Rosenberg, an image of which you will see here. This is another very thin book. I gotta get to my thicker books, but I'm in kind of a reading slump, so kind of picking stuff that's quick and easy to get through. This is book one in the Guardians of the Flame series. I think there were 10 books in the series. I'm not sure exactly. Been a while since I've read them all. I'm just going to talk about the first one. The story opens up, and there'll be some minor spoilers. The story opens up on a group of 7 college students and one of their professors. They're playing a role-playing game. It's not Dungeons and Dragons. Obviously, they couldn't use that. It's trademarked, but it's similar enough in the way that it's described that it's basically D&D. So these guys have a fantasy role-playing session on a regular basis with their professor. And during the course of the adventure starting, these 7 students find themselves transported to another world, the world of the role-playing game they've been playing. They haven't just been transported, they have become their characters. One of the players is paralyzed from the waist down. He has no use of his legs. And he is transformed into a burly dwarf with a battle axe. They become the dwarf, the thief, the warrior, the wizard that they become their characters. And things did not necessarily go well for them. The book, the first intro of the book is them learning they're in this different world, learning that they've become other people, including with occasional memories of their other lives, the lives of their other selves. And this also occasionally causes problems when their other selves try to assert dominance, or they start behaving like their other selves. It doesn't happen often, but it does happen a couple of times. So they're doing what you would think they would do. They're trying to get information. They're trying to figure out where they are, trying to figure out what to do. They do eventually decide to try and go home with no knowledge of how to do that, and no real, they have the skills of the characters they've become, but aside from occasional moments, not the memories, not the full memories. They really don't know anything about the world that they're in. So they have some adventures going forth. They do run into the dragon on the cover. He's kind of a character. I kind of like him. This is also 4 of them. There's a dwarf here, if you can see him. He's the character who's in a wheelchair who is transformed into a burly dwarf. I've also mentioned in previous books that I love the artist who does the cover of these. He draws me in. He's half the reason I bought a lot of the books in the 80s anyway. Is that not just this one, but because I like the artist. So, they're trying to find their way home. They have adventures along the way. They meet a dragon. And they're college kids. They behave like college kids. Even when they're transported to another world and transformed in their characters, they still have the same interpersonal relationships that they had back on campus. Just a slightly different dynamic, that they have different skills. But they're still basically the same people. One of the things I liked about this book, I really liked the intro, because I went back and skimmed through this, how it introduces us to them as college students. In that it's kind of cheesy, kind of cliche, but I think it's also very well done. This book is short, and while I've complained about some other books, I think this book does a good job of of introducing the characters quickly enough that you understand who they are, get a good feel of who they are, and gives us a good idea of their group dynamic. So, like I said, a little cheesy, a little cliche, but I think it's pretty well done. I also think that one of the things I also like about the book is that it doesn't shy away from the unpleasant aspects of being in a fantasy world. Other fantasy novels, especially those based on Dungeons and Dragons, Forgotten Realms, Dragonlance, especially those two, those are the most well-known ones. The world is pretty clean. I mean, you've got villains, you've got bad guys, you have evil deities and stuff. But the people themselves are fairly modern in their attitudes and how they behave. This takes a more realistic look of how people in a medieval setting would behave. They are, especially the ruling class, the people of wealth and power are pretty much free to do whatever the hell they want. You went back in time 600 years to medieval England. If you were a poor peasant, if you were not someone with power, someone with wealth, you would just get walked all over. You did not matter at all. And so that's how this book treats it. Joel Rosenberg wrote this book for that specific reason. He played role-playing games, and he was talking to a friend of his, and his friend was saying, man, I'd love to wake up and be my character. And he'd thought about it. I was like, no, you wouldn't. You would not love to be your character. And he wrote this book specifically because of that. Because when we play role-playing games, and I played plenty of D&D as a teenager and a young adult, it glosses over things. You don't have to deal with the mud and the mosquitoes and the rain and the hardships. If you hire yourself out as a caravan guard, if nothing happens, then you don't have to pay attention to what happens. You're not saddle sore from sitting on a horse all day long. You're not tired, exhausted, hungry, filthy. You get to deal with the fun stuff. And a lot of the books based around Dungeons and Dragons that I've mentioned, the Forgotten Realms, and they do gloss over a lot of that. It does happen occasionally, but this book deals more with the gritty unpleasantness of living in a medieval fantasy world. And it deals it in a fairly realistic manner. There is some unpleasantness that I think I should mention that most people wouldn't like to read about. There is some sexual assault in this book. Later in the book. Not early on, and that is a bit of a spoiler, I guess. But given that is bothersome for some people, I thought I would mention it. Excuse me. But I think my few complaints about this book is that it is kind of cheesy and cliche in parts. Definitely is. But with a book this size, a book this short, I think it really, really does a good job of portraying what it would be like and treating things in a realistic fashion. Going back and rereading this, I was pretty impressed at how well this held up. It felt to me kind of that it wrapped up pretty quickly. The things kind of wrapped up a little too neatly sometimes, but not too neatly to be, I don't know what I'm trying to say. Too neatly to be unrealistic. Let's put it that way. It still kept the harsh realities of what happens here. Those are my criticisms. There is one thing that I think about, or I've thought about when going through this book again. I did mention that at least one or two of the characters have moments, slight memories of their previous lives. And it occurred to me rereading this book again, that these college students basically stole the bodies of other people. Their brains were transplanted into these other bodies, and that's never really addressed, that these people who they were are gone. It wasn't just, they didn't just transport them into another world and transform their bodies. They stole the identities of these 7 people, I think, 6 or 7 people. So it's that's a bit problematic, I think, but it never occurred to me reading the book the first time. But it did, like I said, it did on this new read. And I've read this book and a couple of books in the series a few times. I did enjoy the series, and I enjoyed rereading it again. And of the older books that I've reread, and I've commented on the other short books that I've read, that I didn't think that they held up as well because they just felt too rushed. I think this one does a better job. It's not quite as, you know, not quite as forced and as, heavy-handed. It is a bit cliched, and I've said that, what, 4 times now? I'm repeating myself, so I should probably stop. I'm going to give that movie, I'm sorry, I'm going to give that book, I'd have to say a B+ at this point. There are some things that haven't aged as well. The guys in it are kind of sexist, but it was also written and published in 1983. So it's a product of its times. So it's a good fun read, and I would recommend it. It's a less than 300 pages long. It's very quick. You can get through it quickly. And it's a fun light read. And I also like the premise. I like that Joel Rosenberg, had this thought that no, you would not want to be your D&D characters. You would not, it would suck. And it does. Anywho, as always, thanks for watching. As always, my stuff is crap. And until next time, good hunting.